in Green Spring on this lovely Monday morning. My name is Avan Price and I'm your host today. And today we're talking about Martin Luther King, the Civil Rights Movement, and everything that happened around during that time period. So with me, I have the historian, the more intelligent John Lee resident here with me to join. He's joining me here today, and we're going to discuss kind of Martin Luther King and his upbringing in the South and kind of learn about what was going on within the culture during this time. How are you doing, John?
I'm doing well, Avan. Thank you.
Thank you for coming on the show today. I really appreciate it, just to learn a little bit more about you, your history, your culture, and down in the South, what happened down there, and kind of see how Martin Luther King influenced the time that you saw. So why don't you tell the Green Spring residents where you're from?
I'm from a tiny rural community in central Alabama. Grew up there and lived there until I went off to college. Mm-hmm. And I have to say, though, my perspectives on Martin Luther King and on the whole civil rights movement has to be unique, because everybody sees the world through their own eyes. Mm-hmm. And how the world looks through my eyes may not be the same as other people. Mm-hmm. But also, it's the way the world looks, and my views of the world, my thinking about the world and about the people in it, keep changing over time, hopefully for the better, mm-hmm. hopefully for my maturing, thinking more good things about things. Anyway, in the little community I grew up, I was born in the early 30s, and it was Depression time, so things was tough. And this little community was probably 100 people, mm-hmm. real small, about 3 stores. And there were maybe 10 or 15 white families there scattered over half a mile in each direction, or a mile in each direction. Mm-hmm. And times were tough. My folks always said that we didn't go hungry, but it was close sometimes. Mm-hmm. And so didn't have much money. I mean, if you found a quarter, you were pretty rich somewhere.
I think you could probably buy like bubble gum, soda, candy, a whole bunch of stuff with a quarter back in that time.
Yeah, well, I worked in my granddad's country store there. Mm-hmm. And I did the candy and cookies and the soda drinks and ice cream corner. Mm-hmm. And yeah, with a nickel, you could command a lot of stuff. And you get sticks of candy, little small peppermint sticks, mm-hmm. for a penny a piece. Mm-hmm. And cookies and stage planks, we called them, big molasses cakes. They were a nickel a piece. Mm-hmm. Drinks for 5 cents. And ice cream was double-headed cone, 2 heads on the cone, mm-hmm. and 2 big dips for 5 cents. And it was hard to dip, and I had a stack of Coca-Cola boxes I stood on to reach down into the big boxes to dip the ice cream. And if the customers felt like I didn't make that scoop full enough, they let me know, because I'm paying a full nickel for this.
A full nickel? Yeah. I don't even think that's the sales tax in today's world.
Yeah. Well, but the thing is, as hard as it was on the white people, mm-hmm. it was much worse for black people. The African American community there were a lot more people than there were whites. And so that's one thing I came to appreciate later on. We grew up together and we knew each other, mm-hmm. but, and this sounds terrible to say today, but it's like a situation where like the whites knew their place and the blacks knew their place. That's not a good situation. But they were sort of peace and quiet. We all got along.
Now, can you kind of describe that? You said the whites knew their place and the blacks knew their place. Can you kind of describe what that means?
Yeah, they interacted with whites all the time, and they all either farmed for white people, or they had their own little farms, or they worked as hired hands on the farms, mm-hmm. or in the sawmill there, and. As long as you knew what the rules were, you were good mm-hmm. shape, white or black. Mm-hmm. Whites knew they don't go to certain places, and blacks don't go to certain places. If you were black and you came to a white family's house, you came to the back door. Mm. You never come to the front door. White people knew to stay away from the black churches.
Really?
Right, because that was sort of their peaceful time, their sacred time. And the church meetings would last all day sometimes. And you know, just preach for a while, and you stop, and then you go out and have some fried fish and bread and this kind of thing. But I can imagine, since I wasn't there, I was taken there once by a lady who was helping my mother with housekeeping, and she took me there once because there's nowhere else to go, and she wanted to go.
Yeah.
And so I went, but I was a little kid and don't remember much about it, except a lot of preaching all day. And
still happens in the black church, I'll let you know.
Oh, okay. Well, you get your money's worth there.
Yeah.
But I can imagine what went on there that was the one place where black people could really express their true feelings, their true views, talk about things that they wouldn't talk about in front of white people. And black people, we all lived in houses that needed work, but the black people lived in things that you describe pretty much as a shack. And newspapers were collected by them, and they papered over the inside of the walls with these newspapers to keep the wind out.
Really?
Oh yeah, because that was a good wind blockage. And so it was that way. And now we played, black and white children played together. And so we grew up knowing each other that way. As a matter of fact, there was a family I knew well, we played with a lot, and the father was named Mr. Simmons. That term wasn't used then, no misters. And most all black people were called by the first name. White people were called by either Mr. or something like that. But that's sort of the way it was, but I grew up with this man's name and his wife. He was named A.C. Simmons. But they called him AC. Okay. AC. And he had a son, AC Jr. And that was who my playmate was. We played together. And it's interesting, when they grew up and they left that part of the world, during World War II, I guess, they left. And I never saw the family again, but somebody told me that little AC went to Chicago and became very wealthy as an insurance company man. And I was sitting in my office after I moved to Washington, D.C., after I finished school and everything else. My secretary came in one day and said, there is a young man out here who wants to talk to you, and said his name was, he said his father was A.C. Simmons, Jr. I said, really? Send him on in. And sure enough, it was the son of A.C. Jr., my playmate.
So not your playmate, but the son of your playmate.
The son of my playmate,
okay. And
the grandson of the old man of the family. And he was getting ready to go to graduate school at Cornell University. Had finished school, was finishing school there. He was running for president of his national fraternity. Okay. Nationwide. And he had some flyers he wanted to put out to run for election, and having a big convention in Washington. He needed some help to get some flyers reproduced. Well, the government didn't allow outside people to come in and use their printing presses and things like that. That was forbidden. I'd get in trouble. But they didn't cost that much, and there was a FedEx place right down in the bottom of the building where my office was. So I said, here's enough to make, I think, 200 copies or something like this. But we chatted for a while and caught up with the whole family, and I found out a lot more about the rest of the family after that. His sister became a activist, a civil rights activist. Her name was Maggie Simmons. She married, was named Maggie Bozeman. And she stayed friendly with all the white people there, but she became a real moving activist, which white people generally didn't like. But everybody knew Maggie, so Maggie was everybody's friend. And she'd come around to my mother's every now and then looking for donations to some cause. And depending on what it was, my mother would say yes or no. But she would say, Maggie, you need to be careful. You're going to get hurt. You're going to get in trouble. Oh, I'm all right, Miss Juanita. Don't worry about me. And so, and that family, by the way, went on. Every one of those kids all graduated from college, became real community leaders, civic leaders, everything else, head of the school board, all this kind of stuff. So they're very successful. But that was sort of how I grew up. Yeah.
Now, you talked about like the rules and everything. Now we know in today's world, that's not fair and it's not right. Now,
Right.
back during that time, was there any inclination within either the white community or in your family that just said the way that this separation is going on is wrong? Or was that thought even there at all? I know for sure the black community knew because they're the ones being mistreated.
Sure.
But the ones who is like doing the oppressing, were they realizing?
And for sure they had that thought. I'm sure they should have. But I never heard it. See, I was a kid and I was a teenager and a little older, and we were both sort of a victim of the traditions we grew up under. The way that, as they said, that's the way it is, or that's the way it was. And it never occurred to me that it was ever any other way, and that it should be any other way. Preachers didn't preach about it in church. They preached about everything about love, but they never talked about racial things. And so, but I imagine in the black community, that's where it was. You know, on the little community where I was, there's 3 stores and a few houses, this kind of thing. On a Saturday, that was a big day to come to town, because that's usually the day that people didn't have to work, or they didn't work all day anyway. So that could be on a Saturday, and there was a main state road that ran through the little town, if you want to call it a town. It was gravel, it was not paved, it was a gravel road, State Highway 17. And there would be so many African American people in town, like there'd be several hundred, and maybe 20 or 25 white people altogether. But I never heard a word of dissension between white and black in those kind of situations. Now, sometimes I'm sure to release their frustrations, there'd be a fuss or a fight or something within the black community, among the crowds of people there. There was one black cafe that was open on Saturdays, and every now and then somebody come running into my granddad's store and said, Mr. Lee, so-and-so and cut so-and-so. Bring him in, let's see what we can do, because it was 12 miles, 13 miles to a next bigger town where there was a doctor. There's no doctor around us. And he knew that, 1, you won't find him on Saturday night, and 2, it would take too long to get there. So I've seen my granddad say to other people, sort of help me hold him still now, and put medicine where he was cut, and then one night even sew him up. Big cut in the back. So that's the way it was, and until I left, I never heard much dissension. My dad was very much this way, never liked to see anybody mistreated. There were 2 or 3 white families around, white men around, who everybody knew mistreated people. And that was terrible. My dad would just spit when he'd say their names, you know. I mean, he lived in the same circumstances, the way it is, as everybody else. But he thought everybody ought to be treated right. But he just didn't know and understand. Now, he lived long enough to see all that change, you know, and in fact, he just died a few years ago. And he said it's a much better world than it used to be. But he said, I couldn't imagine these, nobody brought this up. I couldn't imagine things have changed like this.
So in your mind, it was just the status quo. It was just regular.
The status, that's the way it was. And I never thought to question it. The churches should have been questioning it, but they didn't. Churches stayed away from it because they didn't want to, if they lose all their contributions, then they wouldn't get paid and have to shut the church down. So they were just really careful, not say anything, make everybody mad, ruffle somebody's feathers. So they stayed away from controversy.
Well, you kind of touched on it a little bit. You know, you said about the family and the daughter being a strong activist. There was kind of that fear of if you did anything to try to change the status quo, whether white or black, there might be some quote unquote punishment for trying to do that. So were you aware of like any kind of punishments or what could happen if you tried to get involved like that?
I never saw anything terrible like that happen in town, because when I got to be 18, I went off to college. And that was in the early 50s, and there would begin to be a lot of stirrings of change about that time. First in the North, and then the South just said, "It's not going to happen here," and they just ignored it.
Yeah.
But as time went on, and more change came closer and closer, the white people began to scratch their head, and some of them were just downright adamant, not going to happen here, not going to happen here, particularly with schools. And so, those changes began to happen, and some of the people like Maggie Bozeman, I mentioned her name, she got involved in that, and she went off to some group and got trained in how to do things, you know, and but still it was pretty far from home. Now, I was off at Auburn University, and not much changed there. There were no black students in college in there, and it's all white. And now and then, you know, people would sit down and on the TV news at night. We had the first TV set in the college, in our fraternity house.
I know that was a big deal.
Big deal, man.
Black and white, probably a small little box.
Yeah, and people would come over from other places and sit down, lay down on the floor in our living room and watch TV.
How many channels did y'all have back then?
3, I think.
3?
Yeah. Well, you had ABC, NBC, and CBS, and I don't remember what else. But there'd be things on there about marches in Chicago or Washington and New York or something like that, and somebody giving speeches that we say, well, they're just stirring up trouble. They're just agitating, creating problems. Agitation. Now, people don't like agitators, you know. So people would sit around and talk about it, but then they would go away from the TV and that's not here, and they just sort of forget about it and go about their business. I do remember an incident one night. We had a house mother. She was probably 60, 70 years old, maybe. Little white-haired lady, and very nice. But she was a daughter of the Old South, too. And she had an apartment in the fraternity house. And we decided to have a dance one weekend. And so somebody says, I know a really good band. I'll go get them. I'll see if they'll come. And we raised the money. And the band was a black band. And they got them in the house and everything, and somebody said, well, is there a bathroom nearby? We can use the bathroom. Well, the best bathroom in that floor of the house was Mother Gates' apartment. Yeah. So we sent them in there, and we heard her scream in there, and so we come out and said, who are these people in my apartment? And going, get out of here, get out of here. She raised such a fuss, we had to tell them sorry, and we gave them half their money, and they left.
So they didn't perform?
They didn't. Well, no, they would have performed, but she had no part of it. She said, out of here, out of here. And that was a black and white interaction that wasn't good. So.
Well, you said before, I don't want to forget it, you said before there was like an agitation when the change was happening. Can you, since you were there and since you're a product from the South, what was the mindset to be agitated? Like, why would they be agitated about it? What was, quote unquote, hurting them that they were so agitated? What was the problem?
It wasn't. It was they're thinking that the African American people who were stirring up these things and calling for change, they were the agitators. And so, because they were just advocating for change, you know, and people live so way, a long time that way, they don't like change. Change the dining room rules here. They don't like it changed. Okay, but it was well, they were first of all integrate the like restaurants and cafes and stuff like that, and so they had the Freedom Riders come through, and a lot of them got injured and beaten up and this kind of thing, and that's when they ran through Birmingham, and there's a lot of bad publicity there. And then King and some of the people worked with King started having marches in Birmingham, and they would. One of them, I heard white people complaining about the fact that what are they doing? Just stirring up trouble. They're going to create. We always gotten along with each other, you know. Now we're going to stir up problems and create problems. And people won't like to get along with each other. White and
so
black.
in their minds, they thought everyone was getting along.
In
the way that it was separated, they thought it was flowing fine.
Oh yes.
Okay.
But yeah, they So they were stirring up change. Now, people were critical of King. When I heard people talk about him, people were critical. They said, well, he just sent down here from the people up north just to ruin our way of living, just to stir up trouble. And he look at these marches in Birmingham. He put the kids out in front. What parents would put their kids out in front? He didn't care about people. He just wanted to get publicity. All this stuff, you know, they were saying about him.
Okay.
And then there was the Selma March. Made a lot of publicity from Selma. They marched from Selma to Montgomery. And I remember one story. There was a lady from Chicago, Miss Viola Lewis, something like that.
Yeah.
And a white woman who came from Chicago, and people were saying, look at that, this woman, white woman, she's walking there with all these African Americans, and sometimes they didn't use that word. And just stirring up trouble. She's got 4 kids at home. She ought to be home taking care of her kids and all this kind of stuff. Then she got shot.
Really?
Oh, she got killed, yeah. But my mother was at I remember this very well because it raised my mother up quite a bit in my eyes. One day she was at some kind of a gathering. I don't know whether it was a club meeting or something. All the women were sitting around saying, this woman should have been ashamed. She should not have left her children in Chicago. Maybe she deserved what she got. And what they trying to accomplish anyway, marching from Selma to, what they were trying to think they're trying to, blah, 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 blah. On with it. And finally they turned to my mother, who'd just been sitting there quietly, said, what do you think about this, Juanita? What's your thoughts about this? And I'll never forget it. My mother said, she said, I'm thinking about when I meet my maker, he's not going to ask me what other people did. He's going to say, Juanita, what did you do that makes the situation better? I said, oh, you know, that's a lesson. Right? That's a very good lesson. And so they began to mellow pretty much toward what was going on. Meanwhile, I left Auburn and I went to school in Massachusetts. And things were a lot different up there. That was a shot of reality for me. Cold water in the face, it woke me up. And there were marches every day up there, protest marches. The students were all out marching and doing, there were Joan Baez. Remember who Joan Baez was? You don't remember that? Okay. Joan Baez was having a hootenanny every night. You know what a hootenanny is?
No. I mean, I've heard of it, but I'm not fully sure of the definition.
But, and I started listening. First, I thought, well, boy, they just trying to stir things up. But the more I listened, the more I got involved. By the time I left there, I was sold on it. I mean, I was saying, boy, I've been looking at all this wrong all these years. Although I always, and I got very much involved with the African students there, and I spent most of my time with students from Liberia, of all things. And moved to Washington. And then when I was working in Washington, we had some people here, with African Americans in my office, and we had white people. The African Americans were mostly support staff. They weren't the high professionals like they are now. And when the day that King was shot, he was killed, and the whole Washington downtown went up in black smoke.
Really?
Oh yes, oh yeah, it was burning like crazy. And we got orders to get out of town, get away, get out of the office fast. And the black people who worked there with us, we were all very close to because they were very good people and we loved them. And so they said, we can't go back down there. That's all burning. That's, you know, we'd be killed too.
Yeah.
Go back down there. So they all got in our cars with us, in our station wagons and cars. We had people crammed in all the cars. And many of the white people lived in suburbs. And it was easy to get to the Virginia suburbs, so they got in the cars with Virginia suburb people and all went home with us. And we stayed there until they got the word that it was safe to go back. And so we had people at my home, and whoever was driving a carpool that day, you know, we took them home with us. And so that was a scary experience that day.
Well, you mentioned before, because we're running low on time, I wish we had much more time to dive into this a little bit more, but I want to ask this question. You mentioned before that, kind of like, to the Caucasian community, Martin Luther King was seen as a troublemaker. He was just stirring stuff up. Can you kind of tell us what was your own personal view on how, like, when you were like watching the news and when you were reading the newspaper and all that stuff, what was your view of Martin Luther King and everything that he was trying to promote within America?
I can't tell you what my feeling was the day he gave the speech. That ended with free at last, free at last. Thank God Almighty we're free at last. I just children over me, and I said, thank God we're all free. Not just black people, but white people too. Because I remember somebody saying one time, in the South, you can't make progress as long as we didn't change the way we were about race, this kind of thing. And somebody said, it's hard to make progress when you have your shoe or your foot on somebody else's neck. You can't go anywhere either. And I said, maybe this will free everybody, and we can forget about race. We can go back and be brothers and sisters again. And I now read his Birmingham letters, and I've read a lot of the stuff he's written. I think he had, as a single individual, well, Roosevelt saved us, saved capitalism, I guess you'd say. He saved the country from depression and led us through war. But I think no other person brought about positive change in the country in the whole 20th century, maybe before, as much as Martin Luther King did. Because by changing the whole racial relationship and the racial dynamics, it just opened up the world. Now there's still 30 or 40% of the people out there still got problems. But most of those people, they wouldn't object if they go in the store and find an African American as a clerk in the store. They wouldn't object to that. In the early days they might. It's more that I think they have in the back of their mind something that says there must be something inferior. Yeah. And that's why they worry about brown people coming across the border and this kind of thing. Well, I won't get into that, but some people yes and some don't. But it's just, I mean, you go in my little hometown, not the one I grew up in, it's disappeared. It's not even there anymore. But the nearby town where I went to school, which is about 2,000 people, where schools were, all the bank tellers are black, and all the store clerks are black. Half the businesses and the restaurants are owned by black people. It's just, and nobody thinks a thing about it. That's radical change in a short period of time.
It is.
It's a wonderful change. And the only thing is, I'd say that people still have some bug in the back of their mind that when they go home or have a party, it's mainly with white people. But not everybody. There are mixed couples in my hometown, this kind of thing. That would have been the end of you if that happened earlier. So it's a huge change. We have a lot more to go. Mainly in what's ingrained in people's minds is sort of instinctively comes up rather than things that are blatant like they used to be.
Yeah.
So and I think I see a lot of mixed marriage couples. I see a lot of people going to school together, and you do that and you get to know somebody as Avan. He's not an African American, he's Avan. And your whole perspective changes. Yeah. And I just feel I owe a huge debt to Martin Luther King.
Yeah, he certainly did a lot for our society, and he promoted positive change, not bad change. What I like about him is he did it with nonviolence. His
that's the key.
methodology was nonviolent and everything. Well, John Lee, sadly to say, our time is up, but I really thank you for coming on to tell us about not just facts of that time period, but actually stuff that happened, from your own personal experiences and stuff, and sharing that with us in the community. I really appreciate that, everything. So maybe one day we can have you back to continue it on, because I know you're a fountain of knowledge.
not knowledge, just my perspective.
Well, you're just a fountain of facts, knowledge, and just experiences. But I really thank you for coming on.
You're welcome.